Welcome to Cheat Confessions. Let's get started with today's story. She said we had an open marriage. I said, show me where we agreed to that. She said it was implied. I said, nothing that matters is implied. Everything that matters is documented. And I had every document. My name is Callum Reeves. I'm 38 years old. I was married to Priya for 9 years. We met in graduate school, got married at 29, bought a house at 31, built something that I believed in completely and that she apparently decided was negotiable somewhere around year 7 without mentioning it to me. I found out about the affair the way most people find out. A phone left on the counter, a message visible before the screen went dark. I won't describe the contents in detail because the specific words don't matter as much as what they confirmed. That my wife had been involved with a man named Garrett Solis for approximately 8 months and that the involvement was not ambiguous. I set her phone back down, made coffee, waited for her to come into the kitchen. When she did, I asked her directly. No preamble. No accusation I couldn't support. Just a question. Who is Garrett? She went still in the way people go still when they've been preparing for a moment, and the moment arrives before they're fully ready. Then she did something I had not anticipated. She didn't apologize. She looked at me carefully for a long moment, clearly running calculations I wasn't meant to see, and then she said, I thought we both understood that our marriage had some flexibility in it. I looked at her. Flexibility. 9 years. A mortgage. 2 vehicles. A life built around the assumption of honesty. And the word she chose was flexibility. I said, when did we agree to that? She said, it was never something we formally discussed, but I always felt like there was an understanding between us. I said, there was no understanding. There was never a conversation. There was never an agreement. There was never even a suggestion of one. She said, Callum, I think you're being very rigid about something that a lot of couples handle differently. I picked up my coffee. And I thought, she's not apologizing. She's constructing. This was not a confession. This was the opening move of a campaign. And I was going to need to respond accordingly. Here is how the lie was built. Because it didn't emerge fully formed. It was assembled piece by piece over the days that followed, and understanding its architecture was the only way to dismantle it completely. The first version went to her best friend Diane. I know this because Diane texted me 3 days after the kitchen conversation, clearly operating on information she'd received and wanting to check in. Her message was careful and slightly confused. She said she hoped Priya and I were working through everything and that she knew open arrangements could be complicated to navigate. I stared at that text for a long time. Then I asked Diane if we could talk in person. She came over that Saturday. I told her the complete truth, that there was no open arrangement, that I had never agreed to anything of the kind, that the first time I heard those 2 words applied to my marriage was from Priya herself after I discovered the affair. Diane was quiet for a long time. She said, she told me you'd both been operating that way for years. I said, can you think of a single time in 9 years where anything I said or did suggested that? She thought about it. She couldn't. The second version went to Priya's sister Anika, who was more skeptical by temperament and pushed back enough that Priya's story evolved. By the time it reached Anika, it had become, we had discussed it but never formalized it, and Callum is now pretending we never talked about it. This version required me to be a liar. The third version, the one she gave her lawyer, was that we had operated in a mutually agreed open structure for the last 2 years and that I had simply changed my position retroactively to gain advantage in divorce proceedings. This version required documentation to disprove, which was fine, because documentation was exactly what I had. 9 years of marriage leaves a paper trail that no narrative can fully override. Text message histories, email records, shared calendar entries, financial records. The specific texture of a life lived in complete assumed monogamy by 2 people who had never discussed any other arrangement. She had built the lie on the assumption that reality was negotiable. She was wrong about that. I am an architect by profession. I design structures that have to hold under specific calculated loads. I understand the relationship between a foundation and everything built above it. I understand what happens when the foundation is compromised and the structure above it continues to function as if nothing has changed. I had been documenting our marriage for 2 years without knowing that's what I was doing. Not because I suspected anything, because documentation is how I think. I keep records of conversations that matter. I archive significant emails. I photograph things that are important to me. It's professional habit applied to personal life, and Priya had always found it slightly excessive. It turned out to be exactly sufficient. The text message history on my phone went back 4 years. Priya's messages to me across that period contained zero reference to any open arrangement, any discussion of flexibility, any suggestion that she was operating under assumptions I wasn't aware of. They contained the ordinary texture of a monogamous marriage, logistics, plans, expressions of affection, the specific shorthand of two people who have been together long enough to communicate in references. The email archive was more comprehensive. 9 years of communication between two people who met in graduate school and defaulted to writing when something mattered. 9 years of correspondence that read, unambiguously, as the record of a marriage neither party had ever imagined as anything other than exclusive. I also had something I hadn't anticipated having. Garrett Solis himself. Not as an ally, but as a source of information. When the affair became known to people in our social circle, Garrett, who was, by all accounts, a decent person who had been told by Priya that her marriage was open, reached out to me directly. He said he needed me to know that Priya had represented the situation to him in specific terms, that she had told him they had an understanding, that he had believed her, that when he began to understand the reality of what had actually happened, he had ended things immediately. He offered to put that in writing. I said yes. My lawyer said it was the single most useful piece of evidence in the case. I didn't go on social media. I want to be clear about that because it matters for what followed. I didn't post anything. I didn't send mass messages. I didn't call anyone to report what had happened. I simply told the truth when people asked me directly, with the same calm and the same documentation I had been assembling since the kitchen conversation. The first person I told fully was my brother Marcus, who had known Priya for the entire 9 years and who deserved to understand what was actually happening before he heard one of her versions of it. I sat down with him and walked through everything. The discovery, the kitchen conversation, the open marriage claim, the specific ways the story had evolved as it traveled to different people, and the documentation I had assembled that contradicted every version of it. Marcus listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Has she apologized?" I said, "No. She's been too busy constructing a defense to apologize." He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to know the truth. That's all." The truth traveled the way truth travels when it's well documented and consistently told. Not fast, but steadily and without variation. The same facts in the same order with the same supporting evidence every time someone asked. Priya's version required different tailoring for different audiences. My version was just the same thing, always, regardless of who was asking. That asymmetry matters enormously over time. Her friends started contacting me directly. Women who had been told one thing by Priya and were encountering a different account from other directions and wanted to understand the discrepancy. I told them what I told everyone. Here is what happened. Here is what I have that documents it. You can assess it yourself. Most of them went quiet for a while. Then most of them quietly stopped appearing at the events Priya organized. She noticed. She called it my campaign to isolate her. I called it the natural consequence of telling people the truth about what she had done. Those are different things. My attorney was a woman named Helen Park, who practiced family law with the specific focused intensity of someone who had seen every possible version of matrimonial collapse and was no longer capable of being surprised by any of it. She reviewed the documentation I brought to our first meeting and was quiet for several minutes afterward. Then she said, "Your wife's legal strategy depends entirely on establishing the existence of a prior agreement. If we can demonstrate there was no such agreement, her position collapses." I said, "There was no such agreement." She said, "I know. What I need is to make a court know it." The documentation made that relatively straightforward. 9 years of correspondence with no reference to an open arrangement. Financial records showing the structure of a conventional marriage with no unusual patterns that might suggest alternative arrangements. The written statement from Garrett Solis confirming that Priya had misrepresented the nature of the marriage to him specifically. And one more thing I hadn't anticipated having. 3 months before I discovered the affair, Priya and I had attended couples counseling for an unrelated period of stress we'd been navigating around work and family. The therapist, who could not share session content due to privilege but who could confirm factual matters of record, confirmed under deposition that at no point during those sessions had either party raised the topic of opening the marriage or referenced any existing arrangement of that kind. If there had genuinely been an open arrangement for years, it would have been the most natural thing in the world to mention during couples counseling. It was never mentioned, because it didn't exist. Helen presented this in mediation with the particular quiet confidence of someone who has already won before the other side has finished their opening statement. Priya's attorney asked for a recess. When they came back, the open marriage claim was no longer part of Priya's formal position. She had simply dropped it, as if it had never been constructed, as if she hadn't spent 3 months building it, deploying it, evolving it for different audiences. Helen looked at me across the conference table. She said, "That's what documentation does." The moment I think about most from that entire period didn't happen in a lawyer's office or a courtroom. It happened in a coffee shop on a Thursday afternoon when Priya's sister Anika asked to meet me. Anika was 2 years younger than Priya. They were close in the way sisters are close when they've been through difficult things together, genuinely, with the specific loyalty that includes being honest with each other when it matters. She had been one of the people Priya had given her second version of the story to, the version that required me to be a retroactive liar. She sat across from me and said, "I need to know if what you've been telling people is true." I said, "Which part specifically?" She said, "All of it. The open marriage claim. Whether you ever agreed to anything. Whether she told you about Garrett before you found out on your own." I said, "There was no agreement. There was no conversation. There was no suggestion of one in 9 years of marriage." I discovered the affair from a message on her phone, and when I confronted her, she did not apologize. She told me we had a flexible arrangement I apparently hadn't understood. Anika was quiet. Then she said, "She told me you'd always been controlling about her friendships." I said, "Can you think of a specific time where I interfered with any of her friendships?" She thought about it for a long time. She said, "No, I actually can't." She said, "She's been doing this thing, where she builds the story backward, where she creates context that makes what she did seem like a response to something rather than a choice." I said, "Yes, that's exactly what she's been doing." Anika looked at her coffee. She said, "I'm sorry. I should have asked you directly earlier. I should have called you the first time she told me instead of just accepting what she said." I said, "You were trying to support your sister." She said, "She wasn't telling me the truth. That's not something I'm supposed to support." We sat there for a while. That conversation mattered to me more than any of the legal victories. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday morning in March. Priya and I sat on opposite sides of a conference table with our respective attorneys and signed the documents that converted 9 years of shared life into a series of line items. The house, the savings, the retirement accounts, the vehicles, the specific objects that had accumulated across nearly a decade of living together. With the open marriage claim withdrawn and the documentation I had assembled, the settlement reflected a relatively straightforward division of marital assets. Not punitive, not vindictive, simply accurate. What was mine before the marriage remained mine. What we had built together was divided equitably. What she had done was not directly compensable under our state's no-fault framework, but the failed attempt to construct a false narrative had cost her enormously in credibility, which affected every negotiation we had across the 6-month process. When you lie about the fundamental nature of your marriage to your lawyer eventually has to advise you that the lie is costing you more than the truth would have. Priya's attorney had apparently delivered that message sometime around month 3. After that, the process moved considerably faster. She didn't look at me during the signing. I looked at her once, briefly, not from anger but from the specific need to mark the moment, to be present in it rather than somewhere else. She looked tired, not devastated, not broken. Just tired in the way a person looks when they have been maintaining a version of events that required constant management, and the management has finally become more expensive than it's worth. I thought about the woman I had married 9 years ago, who had been, genuinely, someone I loved and believed in and built a life with. who had made a series of choices that I still didn't fully understand and then made worse choices trying to cover the first ones. I signed my name on the final page. Helen shook my hand. Outside the office, the March air was cold and very clear. I stood on the pavement for a moment. Then I walked to my car and drove to work. Because that is what you do when something ends. You go back to the life that remains. 8 months after the divorce, I am sitting in the house that is mine again in the particular way that things become yours when you stop sharing them. The documentation is archived. The legal files are in a cabinet I haven't opened since March. The text message histories and email records and Garrett Solis's written statement are all in a folder I will probably never need to access again. I kept all of it anyway. Not from bitterness. From the same professional instinct that created it in the first place. You keep records of things that mattered, even when they're over. Priya is living in an apartment on the other side of the city. We have no ongoing contact. The social circle that surrounded us for 9 years has quietly redistributed itself in the way social circles do after a marriage ends. Some people going with her, some with me, some simply disappearing into their own lives as if the whole thing had been a dream. Garrett Solis sent me one final message 6 months after the divorce. He said he was sorry for the part he'd played even though he hadn't known the full truth of the situation. That he'd thought about it a great deal. That he hoped I was doing better. I replied once. Said I appreciated him being honest when he didn't have to be. Said I hoped he was doing well. That was the end of that. What I think about when I think about the whole thing, not often, but sometimes, in the specific quiet of a Sunday evening when the house is still, is the moment in the kitchen, when she chose construction over confession. When she looked at me and calculated that building a story was more survivable than telling the truth. And I understand the logic of that calculation even if it was completely wrong. Truth is frightening when you've done something you can't undo. The temptation to build something around it is human and comprehensible. But lies built on the foundation of a marriage that was real have a specific structural problem. The marriage itself becomes the evidence against them. 9 years of genuine life together was the most complete rebuttal imaginable. She had handed me everything I needed the moment she decided to lie. She just didn't know I knew how to build things that hold. Thank you for watching.